Hi, and thanks for joining us for this session on mastering the next generation of Michigan science standards. My name's Francis Vigent. I'm CEO here at KnowAtom. KnowAtom is an organization based just north of Boston, about 20 miles north, and we're a bunch of teachers who have been focused for the past 10 years or so on implementing many of the early recommendations as well as the present next generation science standards in curriculum materials and professional development to support educators in the classroom being really well equipped to deliver a next generation inquiry environment to their students. And when you think about the next generation science standards, I think it's important before we get into our presentation today to think about the reason why all children learn science in school. It's not so that we have all children graduating to be scientists and engineers, but in fact it's so that we are teaching those critical thinking skills, higher order thinking skills such as creating, evaluating, and analyzing in the context of where it's best taught, of children being in the role of scientist and engineer, to develop skills to think scientifically, to solve problems and answer questions with those higher order thinking skills. And what's interesting is that science is a natural crossroads for not only process skills and practices of science and engineering, but for ELA, math, art, and a lot of the other components of our curriculum, history and such. So when you think about why every child learns science and engineering, it's so that they're equipped for life with critical thinking skills. And if 5% of them go on, as they do now, to be scientists and engineers, that's wonderful. And if 6 or 7% it increases to that level, or even it doubles to 8%, that's great too. But the goal is really so that our children as citizens are scientifically literate and they're prepared to be able to understand and really prosecute information that comes to them, whether they're salespeople, tradespeople, or marketing people, or scientists or engineers. So as we take a look into our hour together here, we're going to take a look at the new Michigan K-12 science standards in the sense of what makes them tougher, how they link to ELA and Math Common Core, how these new standards affect instruction K through 12, and how they integrate outside of science, technology, engineering, and math into areas like the arts. Now, the new Michigan science standards are based on the next generation science standards, and they replace the ones adopted in 2006, the general level content expectations and the high school content expectations for science. Michigan's timeline for implementation, or transition timeline, is, I don't know, here it is. It's not quite a timeline as much as a direction in time, with a lot of sort of areas of implementation that are being considered by stakeholder group. So for instance, the teacher preparation component, the Department of Education component, the school district component, the teacher level component, with their own sort of aspects of what they need to be considering implementing between 2014, 2015, and 2020, 2021. And I'm not sure that this is the most useful thing to focus much time on, except to say that the implementation of the assessments is going to drive not only elementary and middle school, but also high school implementation as well. So you probably find yourself now either in a district who has convened teams to implement or has begun trying to implement some of the practices and dimensions into classroom instruction, anticipating the transition of the M-STEP to something that's NGSS aligned. The key component here is that in 2016-17 that field testing is intended to happen, and that the M-STEP, even in 2015 and 16, is supposed to be reflecting some of that NGSS content. So the full implementation is not expected in the assessments until 2018-19. So depending on when you're looking at this, basically the next 2 years is about field testing science and engineering items, and then putting those into practice, and then having it be a full implementation in the M-STEP testing by the 2018-19, 2019-20 school year. So there's a little bit of time in that respect. And we'll take a look at what some of these items look like. Right now, what needs to be happening is really the alignment, and what's intended to be happening is alignment of elementary, middle school, and then high school curriculum and instruction, so that when the M-STEPs are fully transitioned, that students aren't reflecting a learning curve, but actually reflect proficiency. And because a learning curve is going to be evident unless you've made that transition, because these are three-dimensional standards, and the content doesn't exist on its own. It's actually accessed, developed, and used through the practices, and that it's also intended to be seen in connection with cross-cutting concepts, which is a phenomenon itself. So you know, consider the assessment timeline as really being the absolute deadline, but you have basically until 2018-19 to really get everything else up and running, and that's what this, and these are the state's timelines. I mean, these are literally the timelines that they have published. I'm sure you've seen them, and you know, unfortunately, just something rendered like this isn't particularly helpful in terms of understanding the granular steps that are required that the state is taking, as well as the schools and classrooms should be taking. But let's look at those steps that need to be taken, that other states are taking, and that have proven useful as people are transitioning to the next generation science standards. One is awareness on behalf of educators as well as students about the nature of science and engineering, which knit all of the next generation science standards together really at their core. And that's the nature of science and engineering itself, that scientists ask questions, and that they answer those questions by forming hypotheses and developing plans to test the hypothesis. The plan to test the hypothesis has to yield data which we can then analyze and use as evidence to support our reasoning. Engineers solve problems using their knowledge of science, and that is sometimes things that are physical and also non-physical, things that involve electronics, things that don't involve electronics. Engineers solve problems by prototyping solutions called prototypes. They test them to yield data and use that data to reflect back on whether or not that prototype should be refined or replicated. Basically, does it solve the problem? Something that solves the problem is technology. And so when you think about technology, it enables scientists oftentimes to ask new questions, sort of exposes new questions, and also answer those questions differently, or sometimes just answer them, period. And you see that a lot with things like space probes. Scientists have questions, they have hypotheses, but without the technology developed by engineers to actually gather the data, those questions and hypothetical answers go untested and unanswered. Science and engineering are both iterative, and what I mean by that is that scientists, as they learn new things, are necessarily asking and hypothesizing in new ways. Engineers, as they solve problems and new scientific knowledge becomes available, are solving those problems in new and better ways. So this whole thing is a STEM cycle. However, within the disciplines themselves, they're also somewhat iterative. Math is at the center of it all because math helps quantify and communicate observations. Furthermore, math also helps to develop specific plans. If you don't know how much you're adding to something, then it's very hard for somebody to replicate that, and also very hard for somebody to understand your results and actually rely on your results as something that is valid, basically. So math is a tool of communication. It's important that scientists, that teachers, educators all understand the nature of science and engineering, this kind of cycle, the purpose of the disciplines and how they connect. Children should also understand this. If you ask a child if they're in the role of scientist or engineer, if they know something science or engineering, how or why, they can't explain that. That should raise a flag. That's a problem. That's a problem with how the discipline is being communicated to those children. Now, one of the big shifts that is a challenge for folks in this transition is moving away from a traditional model of instruction to a next generation model of instruction. Despite the fact that some classrooms will claim to be doing inquiry, many classrooms who claim to do inquiry are unfortunately still stuck in a traditional model. A traditional model is where content flows through a teacher. The teacher models facts, demonstrates phenomena, and explains what something is. And the student's role in that situation is to recall what they've heard, repeat what they've seen, and summarize the phenomena they've been told about. That's proficiency under that model and under prior testing. There are ways to get away with that level of sort of definition for proficiency. Notice that the teacher's between the student and the content. The next generation model, this is very different. The teacher is acting as a coach to strengthen the connection between the student and the content and not be in between it. Students are developing practices, the skills specific to science and engineering. That's a particular dimension that they're internalizing of these new standards. They're using those skills to develop and use the content and observe the cross-cutting concepts. The content is the disciplinary core ideas dimension, and the third dimension being cross-cutting concepts. That's the phenomena with which you see the content manifesting itself and also connecting itself with other areas of content. The teacher's coaching this. That's really the key here. The teacher's acting as coach and not as expert, as a sage, right? Where they're the keeper of the knowledge. That's not what should be happening in a next generation inquiry environment. Instead, the teacher is gradually adjusting the supports, helping students how to engage appropriately as a scientist or as an engineer, and redirecting and monitoring students in small teams with full release responsibility. And this is all true regardless of whether we're talking pre-K through grade 12. What changes as you transition from one grade level to the next is the number of variables that children are able to wrestle with at any one time, as well as the complexity and depth with which they respond and think about questions and apply their skills. Now, I'm going to come back to it later, but the practices, those particular skills specific to the discipline, are different than the processes, but both are necessary. Practices are skills. They're a tool set. Processes are logic. They're a logical way of progressing from a problem to an evidence-based conclusion, or from, to an evidence-based solution, or from a question to an evidence-based answer. So think about science and engineering practices as the skills dimension. The next generation science standards are designed this way because those skills are used to develop, to really access, to develop and use the disciplinary core ideas. This is the content dimension. And then the cross-cutting concepts come to life as the children are using their practices, their skills, to develop and use the content. And because of the type and nature of the content that's been identified and associated with the performance expectations in the next generation science standards, there are a lot of different systems and content that comes together within any given context, which is why you can't teach these things in isolation. The performance expectation should not be happening in isolation, should not be taught in isolation, even if it's considered grade level specific or grade band. The reality is that the context in which you develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers in the environment relates to a number of other performance expectations which can take place in the same circumstance or scenario, unit, lesson. And these practices are absolutely necessary in order to demonstrate that understanding, but they are not the only practices required. And so you're going to see that, and I'll show you in a moment, that when you look at the 8 practices at a very high level, they are all interrelated. And you should be approaching it that way in the classroom. Content is also interrelated, and the systems are also interrelated. But I just want to focus on the science and engineering practices here. So think about these as the skills which students need to possess as a result of instruction. So not only asking questions, but also defining problems and being able to do that within specific contexts of science or engineering. So again, back to the nature of the disciplines themselves, not only using models, but developing them, not only carrying out investigations, but planning them, not only interpreting data, which is in front of us that's been analyzed, but analyze the data itself, okay? Analyzing raw data. So that's an application of mathematics and computational thinking. Using, or rather constructing explanations in science and designing solutions in engineering. You can imagine that in order to construct an explanation, you need to be able to engage in argument from evidence and obtain and evaluate and communicate information. So that also goes back to the top, analyzing and interpreting data. Where do we get the data? From a planned investigation that we also carried out related to a model we're using to answer that question that we've asked or to solve the problem that we've defined. So these are all interrelated very closely, and they're interrelated through the scientific process and the engineering process. And it's something that students can engage in whether they're in second grade or in 4th, 5th grade or up. These 2 children are engaged as engineers right now, and there's a kind of arc that a class can travel, at least one that we've identified and that we use extensively that I'd be happy to share with you here in a second. But what these children are engaged in is the result of a bit of nonfiction reading, which then came to life in Socratic dialogue, where the teacher wasn't lecturing, but instead asking questions at a higher level that required students to create, evaluate, and analyze in their responses. And what are they creating, evaluating, and analyzing with? The context of what they've read their own lives, the science and engineering concepts in connection with other concepts. Think about Socratic dialogue as playing the role of higher order questions which cause students to make concept to concept, concept to self, and concept to world connections. So once you have that Socratic dialogue, then you're able to come to a problem or question which you can break into teams, and students then wrestle with authentically. And what I mean by that is it's not the result of direct instruction. It's not, here's a solution that I made as a teacher, now you go make your own solution, sort of cliff noting the engagement process, but instead coming to a problem or question where children are going to be taking those skills, the practices dimension, and using them to extend the disciplinary core ideas to solve a problem or answer a question that they're unfamiliar with. So they have some knowledge, but it needs to be extended, and that's also where they are going to see or experience the cross-cutting concepts. That's how, on an everyday basis, what you see here, students planning their investigation and then carrying it out, gathering the data and forming evidence-based conclusions, is a great way for children to actually develop, engage in the practices of science and engineering and develop their understanding. You can imagine that from a Common Core perspective, but also just ELA math in general, that the children are engaging in ELA as well as math standards within the context of the next generation science classroom. And that's again true whether it's the 1st grade or 5th grade or 8th grade or 12th grade. And how that works is that you look at things like Common Core technical subject standards, the nonfiction reading and writing process, writing, evidence-based writing, developing a nonfiction text. All of that happens in a science environment as children are planning their investigations. The other thing is that when you think about math Common Core practices, collecting data, the different operations that need to be applied to raw data in order to actually analyze it, which is why you see that here as its own use of mathematics and computational thinking, but also the analysis, not only interpretation of data. Those are key components, for that reason, because you are applying math in that science environment. So the higher order thinking skills of creating, evaluating, and analyzing cross over all disciplines, but yet a significant amount of time for science under the next generation science standards is actually ELA and math related. When you think about Bloom's taxonomy, the traditional Bloom's taxonomy is a 6-layered pyramid that goes lowest order to highest order, remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. The next generation science standards actually shift that sort of pyramid around a little bit. Not so much that one is higher or lower, we can hold that constant, but what shifts is the fact that higher order thinking happens simultaneously in a next generation inquiry environment, that students are creating, evaluating, and analyzing simultaneously. You can't teach these things in isolation. What you see here is students creating a plan in order to solve a problem, and then they have to evaluate that plan and analyze it as they create and test, and then analyze and evaluate the results of that test of their prototype. So again, when you think about engineering, making something is crafting. Solving a problem by developing a prototype of a technology, testing it, and gathering data, using that data to reflect on the prototype, whether it should be refined or replicated, that's engineering. Okay? That's why it engages all of these levels simultaneously of higher order thinking. Now, we have a new definition of effective STEM instruction or science instruction from the National Research Council. That it's really, to call it new, it's like folks who are still talking about 21st century learning, and we're almost 20 years in. It's been around since 2011. Hopefully this is something everyone's familiar with, but it bears worth repeating here. So effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences. This is their wording. So it starts at pre-K and kindergarten all the way through grade 12. It identifies and builds on what they know, so it's an intentional nurturing process, grade level to grade level, but also week to week, month to month. And it provides those students with the experiences to engage them in the practices of science and engineering. So that's the practices dimension. Again, what we were talking about. An experience to engage in the practices means that I have to use those skills of planning, of analyzing, of so on, really engage them within the context of science and engineering. And what's important about this is that it's not only the way that the understanding is developed, but it's also a key component to sustaining student interest, because they're bringing their ideas to life. They're not following a diagram that somebody else made or a procedure somebody else made or was written on the board. When you think about the next generation environment, it's that shift again from traditional model of instruction to a next generation model of instruction, like I showed you earlier in those diagrams. What you see on the left here is that traditional model. There's no practices going on here. There's pre-teaching. The teacher is handing out the facts, demonstrating the phenomenon, and so on. And those children are trying to absorb all of it so that they can show proficiency under that traditional model. Repeat it back, do what was done, right? We don't want doers. We want children who are being prepared to be scientists and engineers, to really think creatively, analytically, and evaluatively. So that's why you see on the right these students who are tackling a problem that hasn't been pre-taught, modeled, shown to them. They're not following a prescribed procedure that somebody gave them. They're actually developing their own and then going to follow it. So again, a key difference. One of the pivots required to meet the goals of NGSS that comes from peak alignment, which was also developed by Achieve, and you're welcome to grab a copy of that. It's spelled PEEC. And it's something that goes hand in hand, so that would be at a district level, goes hand in hand with EQUIP rubrics for looking at units and lessons. And it's something we take very seriously because we're aligned to all of these pieces, and so making sure that that it's pulling the district and schools together is really what it starts at. And then when you look at units and lessons, to be able to nurture September to June and year to year, that's, you think of EQIP as being at that level. So first at the district level with a peak and then EQIP. But NGSS, when you think about how that gets delivered in the classroom, this is a great example. This is something that's produced fantastic data for us. I'll show you a little bit of it later, and you're welcome to download some examples from our site that will show you how this works as well under the curriculum section at KnowAtom.com. But think about starting nonfiction reading, and that nonfiction reading, instead of being a textbook, put the textbook aside, think about the reading as actually anchoring the concept of reality. Where do you really see this? Where's this happening? What's the current event and news? Something I can actually go visit that brings this concept to life. That's the way we approach the nonfiction reading. And then that being a very small part. So if this was a middle school 5 hours in a week type example, nonfiction reading is like 20 minutes out of a 5-hour time on learning week. You're spending more time on Socratic dialogue so that what you've read about that's relevant to the lesson is actually coming to life. And we have a great webinar on that. I mentioned a whole hour focused on how to have a next generation Socratic dialogue under the resources section. But the Socratic dialogue's job is, again, not to validate or invalidate a student's idea by saying you're right, you're wrong, but in fact to get them to share their ideas, to take risks in thinking, making contributions in a class discussion, and then get other students to pull their ideas about that student's contribution in and basically support or refute with data not only from the reading but personal experience. And so everybody is creating these concept to concept, concept to self, concept to world connections. And you transition from that Socratic dialogue to planning investigations in small teams, students planning those investigations to solve a specific question or problem by coming to a problem or question, which you can break down in teams and do that. So once you have some personal relevance, you have the relevance for a problem or question which you can plan. When you have a plan as a student, and when I say you, I'm talking always about the student here, the student is in a position to carry out their plan and actually be scientists and engineers, gather the data, and form an evidence-based conclusion. So that's your claim evidence reasoning, right? You can't do claim evidence reasoning if you have no evidence. You have no evidence if you have no plan to actually yield evidence, right? What is that has to come from the question, the hypothesis, the procedure, and so on. And then as a result of carrying out the plan, you can form a conclusion, share that out, debrief, and see how other teams have solved the same problems or questions in a different way. And that's where you get that arguing from evidence, that scientific argumentation that's so key under these new standards. So I show you this because I hope it helps kind of tie the elements together. Now you can imagine, and I'm going to show you what a next generation assessment looks like here in one moment. When you think about the practices, the way that those practices get applied is through the scientific or engineering process. Now, it's kind of interesting because I think people who've never really kind of like, it's a good way to put this, engaged the scientific community, people who are innovating, people who are inventing things, people who are developing new scientific knowledge or solutions to problems, don't really understand what the difference between science and engineering practices are and the scientific process or the engineering design process. So I want to break that out right here for you. So the practices that you see in those dimensions, those are the tools for engaging in professional science and engineering, right? The tool set. The process of science, the process of engineering, is how you go from a question logically moving forward towards an evidence-based conclusion. So kind of think of it as a logical methodology. That's why they sometimes call it the scientific method. Engineering design process, when you need to go from a problem to an evidence-based solution, you need to make steps logically. That doesn't mean that science and engineering are prescribed or linear. What it means is that they're subject to logic. And so to form a hypothesis without informing yourself of what other scientists have done or approaches or anything that other people have already tried is kind of an ignorant way of going about things. Doesn't mean that people don't do that, but it's not a very professional way of engaging. Same thing, to come up with an experiment without a hypothesis, what are you actually testing? If you have nothing to test, you have no use for an experiment, you have no use for materials and procedure, you have nothing to diagram without a procedure. So, and so you can see how that logic falls apart. The way that science and engineering are iterative or nonlinear is that if you think about advancing through a process like one of these, you go through and you come to results, and then as a result of the results, you move in a new direction. That's where science and engineering become nonlinear. Just the way that, learning to walk, we learn to walk by taking one step forward at a time. However, nobody spent their entire life walking in straight lines. So with each step, you're able to turn and pivot, and that's how you're able to move in ways that are not entirely straight lines. That's the same case with science and engineering. To kind of make a parallel with other areas of curriculum, in writing, we learn the tools of writing, the writing practices, like word choice, voice, sentence structure. We also learn the process of writing. That's how those tools get applied to take an idea and make it a high-quality published work. The writing process is brainstorming, pre-writing, drafting, editing, revising, and then publishing. So you can see how word choice and voice and sentence structure have a place within publishing, within pre-writing, within revising, and editing, and all of the different stages of the writing process. They serve complementary and interconnected roles. The same thing is true of those science practices I showed you earlier, the practices dimension, science and engineering practices dimension, and these science and engineering processes. It's a little underbuilt. The process aspect of the next generation science standards is a bit underbuilt, and I just frankly think they didn't want to bite off more than they could chew. But understanding and using and teaching the children how to logically apply their practice skills it's where the real performance happens for students, period, within the classroom as well as on testing and so on. I'll leave that alone and just show you what the next generation assessments look like in other places. So assessments that are aligned. Washington, D.C. is a good example. Their assessments have been in development for a few years. They are actually creating essentially item loaning agreements with different states. So places like Illinois basically went to D.C. and said, because of No Child Left Behind and EC, the federal guidelines require that science is tested and so on. We don't have a test at the level that you have it developed. Is it okay if we borrow those items? And they form an agreement, and yes, they've done that. So over the course of basically not even a year, really, they were able to be first in line with DC to have a next generation science assessment that's operational. So those assessments are happening at 5th grade, 8th grade, and then high school level in biology. Key pieces to point out here is that the assessments are still assessing not only the grade level standards or grade span, but all of those prior standards as well. So if you have a sense that something should be grade level specific and you're only going to teach certain standards in certain grade levels, that's a misconception. Certainly you want to be mastering standards in grade level, but you need to be introducing and reinforcing standards from adjacent grade levels. So you can imagine, grade 5 is mastering standards, but also reinforcing standards from grade 4 and grade 3 and grade 2 and so on, and introducing standards from grade 6 and so on. What's important about understanding that that's a key here is that if you don't do that, you have systemic gaps in your curriculum and in your instruction. A student may be the best student in the world and most proficient at what they've learned in your classroom, but if you aren't constructing curriculum with this idea of reinforcing, mastering, and introducing, then if a student is developmentally just on the back side of their peers and not the front side, they may not get something the only time that it's taught. And also, they may not get the reinforcement and exposure that's needed in a future year to be able to connect that content with other performance expectations and other elements of the foundations of that performance expectation, the 3 dimensions. The other thing that's important to realize is that you're most likely going to have, especially if your community is not really kind of closed and very stable, you're going to have newcomers. You're going to have students who may have even been learning English as a second language in the year prior. They might be entirely new to the country, new to the state, new to the school district, or have been chasing rent and moving between schools. All of those are reasons to have really well-articulated curriculum and, right to the level of teacher support, teacher background, and the lessons, not to take away teacher creativity in any way. Teacher creativity under a next generation model is really focused on coaching students skillfully, asking higher order questions, and if you can teach without getting yourself in the way, that's really the highest. If you were to, what does a mastery teacher do? A mastery teacher teaches without lecturing, really by questioning, by getting themselves out of the way and being able to play a coach on the side. That's really what a mastery level teacher does. Sometimes people think, mastery level means that, they know everything about rocks and minerals, but Google's better at that than any mastery teacher. So when you look at these DC assessments, they fall into 3 categories. The type of test items, you have multiple choice, which are selected response, and you also have open response items, which are constructed responses. And there's a third one because it's computer-based assessment that are tech enhanced. What they're doing is they're placing children into those inquiry scenarios where they have to be able to create a response from their own ideas by evaluating and analyzing what has happened in a scenario. And the scenarios mirror the scientific or engineering process, and fictional students applying their practice skills, oftentimes in ways that are not complete, so that the student who's being tested can relate their own understanding and experience to what the fictional students are doing and analyze it by seeing the weaknesses. So here, there's a couple of fictional students who have been growing beans and learning about plant growth and development and wanted to compare how beans grow differently, or asking the question, do they grow differently in soil traditionally than they would in water alone with nutrients? And so there's a scientific diagram, a procedure, data that's been collected, and 2 different conclusions that have been made, but they're really half-baked conclusions. There's no specific evidence supporting the claim. So the student who's being tested is being asked whose claim is correct and being prompted to explain why, using evidence to support that claim that the student who's being tested is creating. So this is akin to creating a conclusion in the scientific process that I showed you earlier. So you have to make a claim, you have to have analyzed the available evidence to give specific data supporting that claim and reason it in writing. So that's what I mean by that process is really important for your students at all grade levels to understand. Those fictional students follow through the narrative in these tech enhanced items, so different organisms that need to be dragged and dropped into their proper place in a food web, and then a constructed response related to that where the children have to actually explain the shortest path for energy to go from plants to the fox, so secondary consumers. And multiple choice have even changed their nature, where those multiple choice are not only a single correct answer, but you have to select 3 out of 6, which are the correct answers. So the idea that you can eliminate a single correct answer, so in a traditional environment where you have 4 potential answers and one of them is correct, teaching children to eliminate the wrong answers can give them a 50-50 chance. That's different now. eliminating a 1 or 2 incorrect answers does not give you a 50-50 chance anymore. And then you see how these scenarios play out again with multiple choice, select 3 out of the 5, another scenario, constructed response to evaluate data to meet the criteria in order to explain which solution is the best solution. So the way that you do this in the classroom to get students prepared for these kind of assessments, using this kind of model I was discussing earlier, and the processes in connection with the practices. And this is an example from 7th grade in this case. And again, a key pivot when you look at the peak alignment, the primary evaluation essential criteria for alignment from Achieve related to the new standards. Students might be reading and discussing things like the water cycle, weathering, groundwater, different earth materials, erosion, and so on. And then through that Socratic dialogue that results after that, they come to a problem or question. In this case, it's science, and they're going to come to the question of which earth materials are most permeable to groundwater. You can see those students in their small teams engage in the scientific process and actually structure an experiment that they're going to carry out in their team using the available materials. They gather the data, they form a conclusion. In the next lesson, they transition and connect that knowledge to the idea of pollution and how there's different types of pollution. It's found in different places, but how is it that pollution in one area can move to another area and impact things like groundwater when it's initially surface pollution, and how that may affect even humans or livestock and things like polluted wells and well water. And so through learning about that, students are able to transition from the hat of scientist to the hat of engineer and engage the problem of a fictional small town needing a low-cost water filtration device to remove sediment from stormwater, non-point source pollution. And so you can see, starting with that problem, they are then advancing to try and solve that problem using the engineering design process, surveying available materials, identifying a range of solutions, and then picking one. They diagram, build and test, gather data from that test, and form an evidence-based conclusion. So that's really, key. Pulling science and engineering together within the same unit within a matter of, 1 week to the next, really key. And this is how students get an intimate understanding of the nature of science and engineering by engaging in the practices and really mastering the disciplines. You can see, I hope you can see how that would happen versus being given some activity to carry out that they didn't plan, that's isolated science or isolated engineering, and so on. So those plans are actual summative and formative assessments. They're summative because they show you how the students understand the content, the skills, and the cross-cutting concepts and their ability to perform the expectation as in the moment as a result of engaging in this in the classroom. However, they're formative when your curriculum and lessons are well thought out. And they're well thought out in the sense of articulation. When they're well articulated, the concepts scaffold week to week and even day to day, and from 1 month to the next, all the way through the school year. They also scaffold from one grade level to the next. So the result of what you see in those lab notebooks, really the lab plans, are areas that you can use to inform instruction. How do you inform instruction? So it shows you whether or not the students understand the expectation of the practices, the processes, whether they have a firm understanding of the content from how they're using it, and their ability to synthesize with that content and that understanding, and also whether they are recognizing the cross-cutting concepts. So overall, you can see if they're demonstrating the expectation, and if not, you create it as a focused correction area moving forward. Other assessments you can think about are things like vocabulary and concept assessments. Again, if you want to see what something like this looks like aligned to NGSS, you can go on our site and just download that month of sample curriculum and see what it looks like. The assessments should be, especially concept assessments, putting students into a context which is not the result of direct instruction, so that they have to then generalize what they've learned in the classroom and then synthesize in a new context. So you get a scenario, and then you get a series of layered questions, each that are teasing out different aspects of the 3 dimensions, so that you get a complete picture of whether the student can perform the expectation. That's what this is showing here. Okay. So when you think about Common Core ELA and math, I mentioned it earlier, when students are expressing information visually, distinguishing between fact and speculation, when they are summarizing text distinct from prior knowledge, and actually following the procedures that they create, those are all examples of Common Core ELA subject standards, technical subject standards. There's also communication, writing, and so on, that it's all happening in this next generation inquiry environment. It's important to realize when a student is just following a multi-step procedure, whether it's written or pictures or diagrams, that's all ELA. Okay, not science. Creating the multi-step procedure is science. On the Math Common Core side, making sense of problems, reasoning, persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments, using tools appropriately and with precision, expressing, looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. These are all things that you do as part of engaging in the scientific process, using your science and engineering practices, those skills as a student, and all part of forming procedures, those, the actual tests that we are going to use as part of the scientific process or the engineering design process, and forming conclusions and such. So you can see, again, back to that idea, when we really approach science and engineering authentically, we hit a lot of different areas of the curriculum in a very solid and authentic way. Thinking about sort of resources in that transition, so each kind of resource produces its, can only rise to a certain level. So awareness-ready resources are kind of the free resources you can get online and from museums. They are often, created to explain about engineering and make it simple for kids to understand, this is engineering, so they can identify who an engineer is and what their role is. Same thing, companies often do this to explain how they use physics or wave energy in some product they develop. Knowledge readiness is a textbook kind of thing, where explaining all about what scientists have discovered or technologists or engineers have developed in terms of technology to solve problems. Performance readiness is what you would classically see with kits, those kind of 3-unit, 4-unit a year model kits, where there's some materials with a bunch of activities related to it, so you can talk over and over about the same things and explain over and over, and you have a kind of culminating activity where students can see the demonstration again for themselves by following a procedure or a diagram to gather some data in a data table, maybe reflect on that. That's performance readiness. A good example is learning all about rocks and minerals and their properties, and then learning how to carry out hardness tests and streak tests and those sort of things. Performing a task related to a particular question, a particular prompt. That's performance readiness. Mastery readiness is the kind of thing we aim at, which is when you look at those scenarios, what's really required of the student to have internalized, developed a skill set in a logical framework through understanding the scientific and engineering process in the context of all the different content that's required of students across those strands: earth and space science, life science, physical science, engineering the applications of technology and such that a student can go into an unfamiliar scenario and be able to analyze it, evaluate it, and create their own opinion, which they can then use the results of analyzing the available information to construct a response that is, complete with claim, evidence, and reasoning. That's what mastery is all about. An example of that would be being putting a student into the context of a scenario where there's a architect or an engineer that's engaging in constructing a commercial kitchen, and the scenario is that the commercial kitchen needs to be durable. It has to go through all these sort of different activities and stresses and such. And there are all kinds of different materials for countertops that have been sent, and here's a whole table of those and their properties, their costs and their characteristics under heat and load and being shocked by things dropped on them, whether they fracture or cleave and such. And a student who has mastered the practices, the content, knowledge, and the processes and the phenomena should be able to analyze the requirements and really the problem here that a countertop needs to solve, and look at the available data and be able to make a claim about which material, whether it's granite or wood or marble or glass or stainless steel, is the most effective for the application based on its unique properties. And so they should be able to argue from that evidence and really reason to support their claim. So that's what mastery readiness is all about. Now, the way that the next generation inquiry environment comes together is really in this culture of critique. That's also the culture in which artists are trained, whether it's formally or informally. You see, artists are engineering communication. That's what art really is. Unfortunately, a lot of people talk about STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, and they don't understand that art is engineer communication. They unfortunately, at times, can get stuck in the idea that art is about making things pretty. It's about an aesthetic. When in reality, artists don't go to jail for making things pretty in places where speech is being repressed or, being squelched. However, when you look at great artists, that's exactly what happens. Why? Because they make statements that are clear and also unpopular with, individuals who are in power or otherwise in places where free speech doesn't exist. So think about art as engineered communication, and I would use the example as evidence to support this, that someone like Pablo Picasso in his work Guernica here, he was living in exile when he created this. He was living in exile from Spain, his home, and he was horrified by the atrocities being committed by the fascists at the time in places like Guernica, a particular village. And so when he was commissioned to do a work of art for an international art exposition, he created this oil on canvas painting and named it after this town where the atrocities had occurred. It's not particularly pretty, but it's designed to send a statement about what has happened to people, to animals, to life, the chaos, the destruction, and such. And so when he sent it, the fascists came back and they said to him, "What did you do?" And he said to them, "I didn't do it, you did." So just in that exchange, you see that it was a very intentional, targeted statement to the fascists as well as the world about, the need to stop and recognize exactly what's happening here. So when you think about the science and engineering practices as well as the other areas that are integrated into science time on learning now, we are equipping children to be able to communicate scientifically, to be able to engineer communication, and thereby really engage in communicating and receiving communication, and frankly, to consume and produce art at a deeper, more profound level. So, it's just kind of interesting that both scientists and engineers are, as well as artists, are created or really trained within a culture of critique. And so when you go to any of the best art schools, you'll see that they're really learning less about how to hold a brush, how to mix paint, and much more about how to make their ideas something that comes through to a specific audience within a medium, whether it's sculpture or dance or music or oil on canvas. So it's just something I wanted to point out. The role of curriculum professional development and materials is just to support that learning environment. So again, instead of spending time at Walmart and downloading things off the internet and trying to mix them all together, really your goal should be to have something that fits hand in glove between your curriculum and that classroom experience and the materials and professional development, and have that be something that's nurturing September through June and from one grade level to the next. If you're able to do that, whether it's through your own creation or adopting a creation like ours, for instance, you stand to gain a lot under any testing, the present as well as the NGSS aligned testing. And what's great is those who don't make the shift to a next generation model of inquiry are the ones that once the testing shifts, it's going to become very obvious that the children have not developed the skills in connection with the content and are, and so on, the way that we've been describing, because those scenarios are going to be things that are pretty daunting, whether multiple choice or open response. But what you can see here, and I'll give you an example, a few examples real quick. This is an example from Massachusetts, which their average is 50% advanced and proficient combined. Here's a suburban district that went from average to well above average. They're only 20% high needs and 7% low income, however. But you can see they could get a 20-some odd point gain, actually even more of a 30-point gain. When you look at districts that are more of an urban profile, you see similar but different results. So here's an example of a very inner city, kind of typical urban school district, something that you might see in Detroit, for instance. So what happens here is you see them going from below that state average of 50% proficient to well above 50% advanced and proficient. They, over the course of 2.5 years, added 51 points to their advanced and proficient scoring students. So they were some odd, like 87% here. Now, what you see is a positive trend, but yet there are corrections. Why are there corrections? Well, there were shocks to this community. Major turnover in teachers, major turnover in administration, and that has an effect. What's interesting, though, is that the children don't fall all the way back to square one, because they have developed a skill set, they have exposure, and they understand basically how to think their way through problems and questions. And they have some background to lean on, so you can see that they're able to pick up and yet see a positive trend here. And of course, in urban districts, oftentimes, as was the case here, that there's challenges when it comes to professional development when they roll somebody new in. So there's a learning curve that's reflected here. This school is 35% ELL, 72% low income, 65% free lunch, 75% high needs. So significant challenges there. I'll show you a middle school as well. This middle school was performing only 4% proficient, 54% were below basic, warning and failing level students. And over the course of 2 years, they basically cut that in half. They went from 54% to 27% in those lowest categories, and they increased their proficient and advanced by 24%. And what's interesting is, when you look at the average level of advanced and proficient scoring students in the 26 largest cities in Massachusetts, which this is a member. These folks, these students are part of those 26 largest cities. This school is now performing at average for those cities. So it's not a it's not a lost cause here for them. They have a positive trend, and in the course of 2 years, they've made it from bottom of the barrel to average, and then now they can progress towards that 50% level of state average and hopefully beyond. And when it comes to the cut and warning, I mean, that's the most sort of exciting thing as well, because frankly, these were children who, when you look at warning and failing, were virtually getting nothing out of their instructional time. It was undetectable, virtually undetectable. So the demographics of that school, 64% first language is in English, 95% low income, 87% free lunch, and 97% high needs. So significant challenges. And again, the data up here. Other examples, other states, New Hampshire being one, you can see the tall bars are the students who were engaging in the next generation inquiry curriculum that we had developed and they were using versus the state averages, which are the pink and this sort of teal color. So purple and yellow being ours. And so depending on, even though this is not aligned testing, it's state level testing that's not yet aligned to NGSS, you can see there's 20 to even 30% almost improvement over the state average. So really significant gains. We're coming up on the hour. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop those in if you're in the live session. If you're not in the live session, either way, I'd like to let you know that looking more closely at classroom resources, you can join us for, again, a free webinar looking at strategically implementing the NGSS. You can go to KnowAtom.com/strategically. If you have any questions about anything that I've mentioned or that you thought of that I'm not able to address through questions now, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy. If it's something quick, she may be able to answer it. If you'd like, again, I'm Francis Vigend. I'm a CEO here, again, former teacher, and all of the folks on our staff have former teaching experience. Feel free to reach out if you mentioned me by name and would like to either speak to me or send a question along. She'd be happy to, I'm sure, get that to me, and we'll respond personally. Resources you should be aware of, again, all free stuff you can access, whether it's to get an idea or whether you're part of a curriculum committee and you're trying to make a decision that's going to move your district forward in alignment. There are those curriculum resources. There's the link. Free case studies you can download, KnowAtom.com/results. And stay connected. We put a lot of information out through our blog. You can get to that, KnowAtom.com/blog. Also Facebook.com/KnowAtom, and Twitter @KnowAtom is our handle. There are more live and on-demand webinars, ebooks, even discussions with innovators. We do have a discussion with the CEO of iRobot coming up shortly. It hasn't been posted yet, but you'll be able to find that under our resources section as well, along with at-length discussions about STEAM, the combination of arts and science with some college presidents, art college presidents, and other innovators as well. And you can check all of that out, KnowAtom.com/resources. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. There are a couple of questions in here. I'm just going to take one quick moment to try to combine them all into one or two questions that I can answer now before we jump. So couple of the questions here deal with, so the first one dealing with lecture, and maybe you joined late. So lecture doesn't have a place in the next generation science standards, and I'll just pull that diagram up again. Lecture is a traditional model. The teacher handing the content to the student and the student trying to remember and recall. That's lecture. Lecture doesn't have a place because we're dealing with a next generation inquiry model where the teacher's acting as a coach and strengthening the connection between the student and the content by helping that student engage their skills to develop and use the content and observe the cross-cutting concepts. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, so lecture doesn't have a place, but Socratic dialogue does have a place. And I was just mentioning the resources section of our website. Go in there. There's a great 1-hour piece that walks you through how to actually have a next generation Socratic dialogue with students so that you're not lecturing, but you're actually asking higher order questions and forming triads among students in the class and engaging them, their thinking, and engaging them in the expectation that they take their skills and think deeply about the content and the context and refute or support each other's claims through that discussion and their different ideas. So lecture doesn't have a role. Similarly, someone asked a question about textbooks. Textbooks, they don't really have a role. The reason is that whether they're electronic or, cloud-based, locally based, paper-based, whatever, they don't really have a role. And the reason is, what you want to do is any kind of text is an opportunity to anchor a concept in reality and act as a base for students to inform themselves about a problem or a question before they form a hypothesis or a potential solution. So anchoring concepts in reality is a great way to go. Textbooks typically don't do that. They might have little vignettes, real life application type thing, but textbooks traditionally take a concept and they generate a paragraph to explain about that concept and put pictures with it. So it's almost like, you could generate a textbook with a bulleted outline that just, take definitions and sort of morph them into paragraphs and try to scaffold those paragraphs, whether it's electronic based or paper based. So, I wouldn't make that the focus of my realignment efforts, if that's what you're thinking. And again, I don't know what you're thinking, but if that's why you ask, I just mentioned that. The last question I'll take before we conclude, and again, if you have any other questions, feel free to send those along to Mary Ellen, and be happy to take those offline. So the last question here has to do with ELLs and special ed. So ELLs first. So ELLs are verbal first. And so the nice thing about what I've been describing to you and these next generation science standards and the next generation inquiry environment is that when you think about the potential, and I'll use the example from the way that we structure lessons, the only thing here that is text-based is the nonfiction reading, which in an ELL environment can be done aloud. You can read aloud and integrate that into your Socratic dialogue. So again, making everything verbal. And then in a self-contained ELL environment, if a student can't write in English, you can write together, you can brainstorm together, because again, ELL environments, especially self-contained ones, you're dealing with under 20 students, typically 12 to 15 by law. So the key here is that you can plan that investigation together as a class and then all break up and use your plan in small teams so students actually carry it out themselves and they've contributed to it verbally in class. So again, leverage the verbal first, okay? Carry out that and then use the data that's collected. The nice thing is that numbers transcend language in most cases. It depends what language is the child's native language. And some children, ELLs, are not actually proficient in their native language. That's another thing a lot of educators don't realize if they haven't been in an environment that's really heavy ELL, is that oftentimes, if a student is an English language learner, but they are proficient in their primary language, it's much easier to transition them over and much quicker, because essentially they're going through in their mind, okay, this word equals this word. However, if a student isn't proficient in their native language, it's really a language acquisition issue in English, period. But what's really great is that regardless, oftentimes students don't have a word in their native language to describe the phenomena or what they're seeing. So what's great about that is that the actual experience of engaging in the practices, developing that data by carrying out the plan we've done together in class and carrying that out, they want to be able to explain what they're seeing. So they want to know the word for that. Nobody has that except in English, and we've seen that actually. It's really been neat to see the state reviews come back on what they consider abnormally high, I take that as a compliment, abnormally high levels of engagement and so on, and language acquisition in these kind of environments. Special education is sort of a different flavor of the same issue. So special education really comes down to what's on that student's IEP. So again, if that is a language-based learning disability, what you're doing is just taking the text off of the page perhaps. So making it something that a student can listen to. So I know we have clients that do that. So, you know, the readers are available in print. Oh, if they can't read off the print, then it's available electronically. If they can't read off of a reader electronically, then that can be put into either a Kurzweil reader, or the electronic version can be read aloud by the Adobe program or the Kindle program or so on. So again, it moves it off of something that's the barrier being text on a page to something that's auditory that a student can deal with. On the flip side, making a plan, you know, it doesn't have to be pen to paper. It could be typed into a Google Doc with version control. It can be spoken aloud and voice to text. So the goal here is to remove the barrier. Now, if you're asking this question because you have children who are below grade point level, well, that's also easy to deal with, because what you're doing is you're basically, and well, in our case, what we're doing is we have identified below grade point level entry points, primary evidence that you're gathering, how to isolate, you know, different aspects of the performance expectation. And when it comes to perhaps portfolio assessments, if that's one of the reasons why you asked this, alternative assessments, portfolio assessments, what you're doing is you are collecting primary evidence around what that student can access at the grade point level they are at. And so you may even be throttling back the level of the curriculum to a prior grade level, because, again, you may have multi-age, multi-grade special ed classroom where students are operating, you know, at a third grade level when in fact they should be at a fourth grade level or something of this nature. That's how that gets dealt with. And it's also dealt with within mainstream classrooms in how you pair students, and some of that as well is sort of a way of dealing with it. But that's something we deal with in a whole other venue of professional development. So I hope that's a helpful few answers for everybody. If you do have other answers, other questions that you'd like answered, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen. My name's Francis. I'd be happy to get back to you if she can't answer your questions for you, and I hope that you'll join us for another webinar sometime in the future. Thank you very much, and good luck on transitioning to the next generation science standards. Bye-bye.